views and comments of the hosts and guests are not necessarily those of the station.
Hello, Philippines. This is Eric Lecain with World News Jam. We bring you the most interesting stories from around the world each week. We just don't give you the news, but we tell you the story behind the news, as well as read and answer your questions in an entertaining and easy to understand way. So please join us on DZRJ 810 AM Radio Bandito TV and get yourself updated with all the interesting news of the week from around the world right here on DZRJ's World News Jam.
Watch and listen to World News Jam every Sunday from 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. airing on Sky Cable Channel 224 and on all DTT boxes. Simulcasting online on Facebook and YouTube. Listen and watch on your mobile devices. Just search DZRJ Radio Bandido.
Hello and welcome to the World News Jam on DZRJ Radio and RJ TV. My name is Eric Lecain. Thank you so much for spending your Sunday evening with us, whether you are on Sky Cable Channel 224 or YouTube or Facebook or TV Plus boxes or 810 AM on your radio dial. We're just so happy that you are here with us. The World News Jam is your weekend wrap-up, some of the top news stories of the week, some of what I think is interesting, and I hope you will too. Now, this week, the stories I will be talking about are entirely based on questions I have been asked this week in conversations I've had with Filipinos. Now, on the show, we don't talk about the news going on in the country because, well, DZRJ already has packed with great shows talking about local stories. We look more at what's going on outside the country, stories that are on Filipinos' minds, and what they want to know more about. So this week, I started writing down all the questions and conversations I had with other colleagues, people I have met and talked with at events, especially taxi drivers who always seem to love to talk about world events. So the subjects this week we were going to get into, of course, the Russian news, which is very big this week, the breaking story surrounding the impeachment of the U.S. president. Where will Israel end up after the war? The U.S. is back on the moon, how Trump is going to pay his massive court bills, and much more. So let's get to it. Now, first up, I got into a conversation with a group of Filipinos this week in which the subject can be very confusing. When does life actually begin? So, before we take a shot at this, let's learn some acronyms. First of all, what is ART? A-R-T. Well, that is a question that many art museums have to ask from time to time and sometimes get horribly wrong. But what is the acronym of ART in regards to the medical field? Assisted reproductive technology, helping people who want to have babies but can't naturally, so they get a little help from modern technology. So what are some examples of ART? Well, one is GIFT, gamete-intro-fallopian transfer. That's a procedure that involves removing the eggs from a woman, combining them with the sperm, and immediately placing them in fallopian tubes where the eggs get fertilized. Later, this leads to pregnancy. Also, ZIFT, which is zygote intrafallopian transfer, which is similar to GIFT, but the eggs are returned via laparoscopic surgery. Of course, not to be confused with FET, a frozen embryo transfer. This uses frozen fertilized eggs, which are then placed into the uterus. But the one you always hear about, the one that we are discussing, what is all the hoopla about, is IVFs, where the doctors join the woman's egg and the man's sperm in a test tube outside the body. This has become one of the most popular procedures for a couple that can't have a baby due to infertility. Whether it's a woman that has gotten a bit older, making it difficult to become pregnant, or she has problems with ovulation or reproductive tract blockage or damage to her fallopian tubes, or maybe the man has a low sperm count. It also allows couples in which either the man or the woman is infertile, can't have a baby, or maybe a same-sex couple wants to have a baby, want to have their DNA and their offspring. It's the modern medical answer to people who can't have a baby on their own. But there's a real trick to doing this. First, you need about 10 to 12 mature eggs to get it to work right. But in the end, you will only actually use one. The ones not used are sometimes referred to as maybe babies. So what do you do with those extras? Well, there's a couple of choices. You could donate them to an infertile couple, but of course, that means there might be a child walking around that looks a lot like you, or you could donate them to medical research for study. You could keep them frozen. It costs about $800 per year, or you can have them destroyed. Now, for some couples, just want to do the freezing thing, save them for a later date if they want to have another child, but once that time passes for them, they want to have more children, or let's say they get a divorce, or for whatever the reason is, may come a time in which they want those embryos destroyed. And this is where our story begins, and it comes out of the U.S. this week. There's a big question being asked in the courts. When does life actually begin? When is a person a person? All those embryos being held in a test tube, are they really people yet? And if the embryo in the test tubes are deemed as people and we destroy them, what does that mean? Is that considered part of the medical procedure? Or is it murder? We know from the political issues surrounding abortion that many in the U.S. consider that to be murder, but that's when the egg is still in the mother. So what if the egg is outside the mother? And it's in a test tube, and it's in a lab? Well, in Alabama, the courts decided that even if an egg is in a test tube or frozen in a medical cooler, it's still a human being. And then if you destroy that genetic material, that is now considered wrongful death to that person. And now we get into the irony of this whole matter. A couple wants to have a baby, and IVF is their last solution. But in order to have that baby, they will have to artificially create that child in a lab. Unfortunately, it's not perfect science, and some eggs will not fertilize, just like in the womb. But because this happens not naturally, it's deemed illegal now, which now is stopping the person wanting to have the baby. So, in other words, to save the child, we are stopping women from having the child. Kind of makes your head spin a little, doesn't it? Also, there's a case pending of a woman who dropped a test tube vial with an egg in the vial. She may now be sued for wrongful death of a minor. So the organic matter or genetic material or egg is now considered to have the same rights as a minor. Now, we know that recently the U.S. Supreme Court rules that there will no longer be a federal law giving a woman's right to abortion. It's now all up to the states. So some states let women have abortions, and some women can have up to a point and still have an abortion. But like places like Alabama don't allow abortion almost in any circumstance. So this ruling came from the Atlantic Supreme Court, Alabama Supreme Court. 8-1 ruling, they said that a parent can sue an institution for the destruction of a frozen embryo, and the person responsible for that destruction or decision can be liable and possibly criminal charges. Anyway, that's the way I understand the ruling. The ruling has an interesting wording that human life cannot be wrongfully destroyed without incurring the wrath of a holy God. So in other words, they are basing this ruling on a religious belief that only God can decide when a child dies, even if that child is not yet a viable fertilized egg. Not the parent, not the medical facility. Only God has the right to decide. But of course, since we can't subpoena God in for questioning to see if he really believes, well, we'll have to take what the court says so. But what's interesting is that this new law seems to be hurting the people that want to have the baby. I mean, if a couple wants a baby, and this is the only way to have that baby, but in order to do that, you have to remove 10 eggs. So you either have 10 children or you can't have any. As many are saying now that you are hurting the people you are supposedly trying to help. So the next step in this is that a lawsuit may be taken to the Supreme Court because this law has taken away a person's legal right to use IVF to have a baby. And here's where the problem is. The Supreme Court no longer makes up the layout of the national population. There are 6 conservatives and 3 liberals. This is not the makeup of the USA. So there's a good chance that the option for using IVF to have a baby may be no longer legal in some states. People have said that when the federal right to have an abortion was overturned, that other medical procedures, such as IVF, may be deemed illegal, that there are other possible things that a state courts could overturn based on religious beliefs, such as contraception, birth control, condoms, also same-sex marriages or sexual relationships of 2 men that could be found. You could be criminally charged for the acts. I guess the question should be, should we base our laws on personal religious beliefs? And when it comes to science and religion butting heads, how do we decide who's right? I mean, science is making breakthroughs every day. The science of having children has come a long way in the past 10 years, and it's probably going to just get even better. Soon children may not be born with any afflictions or any disease at all. But is this the work they need to do to that point to save lives? Are they going to need to destroy unused eggs to do it? I don't know what the right answer here is. However, it seems like in these cases, it should be whatever your personal religious beliefs are, what would decide what happens to your extra genetic material. Does life begin when a heart beats, or does it begin when a woman ovulates? These are 2 very different stages in the course of life. So should it be that the mother decides, or the court, based on what they think their particular God would think? If you have a comment or a question on this subject, please write it in the comment section on the DZRJ Facebook page, because I'm sure we're going to be talking about this again, as this is one of these things that is not going to end soon. So, Russia has been in the news a lot this week. Of course, last week we talked about the interviews with Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin, the one where Vladimir Putin went on a 45-minute tangent about the history of Europe, that really World War II was caused by Poland for not taking the deal Hitler made to them. Later, after the super soft touch interview was over, Putin was talking on Russian TV. He said that he had planned to answer very tough questions from Carlson, which just never came. He said he left the interview unsatisfied. In any case, Tucker has gotten blasted this week from both the Democrats and the Republicans because at the same week of the interview, the opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who was being held in a Russian gulag in the Arctic Circle, supposedly fell over dead while taking a walk. As I said on last week's show, I was surprised he was allowed to live as long as he did. In Russia, if you're with the government opposition, you have either left the country, or you are in hiding, or you are dead. But Alexei was something special. He was someone we had talked about many, many times here on the show in the past years. He was basically the only true opposition to Vladimir Putin in the past 20 years. Like I said, he was being held in a Siberian gulag, which is a prison work camp somewhere above the Arctic Circle. It's been a shock to the world that he is dead, but not a shock as to how he died. According to the Russian authorities, the 47-year-old died of natural causes while on a walk. The seemingly fairly healthy man just one day fell over dead. The reason is, no surprise, in that literally no one believes that he just fell over dead. Many around the world, everyone around the world that I have seen believes Putin finally put in the order to have him murdered. Can we prove that? Maybe never. But some people are really trying to find out the truth. The Navalny Anti-Corruption Foundation said this past Friday that they will give 20,000 euros for valuable and complete information about the murder of Alexei Navalny. They are calling on the members of the Russian military, the law enforcement, to come forward and show solidarity with civil society by contacting them with information about the circumstances that led to Alexei's death. They said that anyone that comes forward can do so anonymously and that they will help that person to leave the country if they want. But the real interesting story this week is the fight for the body of Alexei. Obviously, the Russians don't want to give up the body and the clues it may give us. However, his mother, Lyudmila Navalnaya, wants her son's body back so that she can bury her son. According to the law in Russia, which seems somewhat meaningless when it comes to Putin, but if you die while in custody, the government must return the body to the family. Well, an investigator did call Alexei's mother, gave her an ultimatum. Either she agrees to a secret funeral without telling the public within 3 hours, or Alexei will be buried somewhere near the penal camp in the Arctic Circle, of which you will never know exactly where. Now, Alexei's wife, who was in exile, and his mother have been on a mission to get the body returned to them so they can have a proper funeral. Although if that were to happen, if there was a public funeral, the chances of tens of thousands or even more probably likely show up to pay homage to their hero. The family said that the Kremlin does not want the world to see large crowds honoring Navalny. They even threatened to just let the body decompose unless the mother agreed to their demands. Now, supposedly the Russian officials claimed that they had showed the mother the body and that she signed the death certificate saying that he died of natural causes. But according to the spokesman for the family, the mother had refused to negotiate with the investigators and demanded her son's body be returned to her immediately. An official with the Navalny group said that the public has a right to be able to see Alexei one last time. She said the problem is Putin sees the funeral as a rally that will create political turbulence for him, and he doesn't want to see this on TV, especially now that the election for president for Russia will occur in just a few weeks. In that election, Vladimir Putin will run against, that's a good question. There was a guy named Boris Nadenshin who was supposed to run, but he has been disqualified, just like Navalny. Just all the other recent anti-war activists, they have all been systematically removed. Boris says he now fears for his safety and the safety of his family, but he also said that his family is united in the need for Russia to once again become a free society. But the Kremlin has said they didn't consider him a real threat. However, just to be sure, he's been disqualified. So basically, Putin will run against 3 other people. Those 3 others are supposedly on the ballot, so that the election has the appearance of being a free and fair election, although is it expected that Putin will get probably 99% of the actual counted ballots. But even so, many believe that the election is very important to Putin because it's a propaganda tool to spread the hopelessness among the people that want him out of office. Many around the world think the actual number of public that is pro-Putin in Russia is very small. That in an election where, let's say, Alexei Navalny were the candidate, Putin would not win. However, we will never know because Alexei Navalny is dead. As we have seen throughout history, if you are not, or if you are an autocratic dictator, which is not loved by your people, but rather feared, the best way to stay in power is to remove anyone who stands up against you. And as Alexei's mother might say, Putin is very good at that. This week, the president of the U.S., Joe Biden, called Putin a crazy SOB. He was speaking out after the Navalny murder, in which the U.S. president is slapping even more sanctions than there were already on Putin. The president said that when it comes to Putin, we will always have to think about nuclear conflict, to which the Kremlin responded, "It is clear that Mr. Biden is demonstrating Hollywood cowboy-style behavior to endeavor his domestic political interests." But if you watch that speech that Biden gave, honestly, I don't think Biden is just saying things for his political interests. I think he truly dislikes Putin and Trump. Biden slammed Trump for comparing his legal troubles to the death of Navalny. When Trump asked this week when he was asked about the death of Navalny, he claimed that he was being persecuted much in the same way as the anti-corruption opposition in Russia. Biden later said that a lot of Republicans, there's a lot of them that I disagree with, but they've been decent men and women. They at least had an American moral center. That seems to be lost with some of the things this fellow Trump has been saying. Biden went on, it's like he's comparing himself to Navalny and saying that because our country has become a communist country that he's being persecuted like Navalny was persecuted. I mean, where the hell did this come from? Biden also said that Putin cannot stay in power. So even though Trump seems to adore Putin, Biden absolutely hates this man. In fact, after the death of Navalny, all those around the world that hated Putin seem to hate him even worse. This may be the reason Putin gave a very, very fancy car to Kim Jong-un this week. As you remember from last week, Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, proclaimed that South Korea is now his mortal enemy. So he's not making any new friends. However, he and Putin have really hit it off recently, so much though that Putin gave him a new car. When Kim was visiting Putin, he saw the Russian-made limousine and he loved it, so Putin had one given to him. The president of the Russian Federation, Peskov, said that North Korea is our neighbor, our close neighbor, and we intend and will continue to develop our relations with all the neighbors, including North Korea. I'm not sure what other neighbors have gotten a free car right now. It seems North Korea is the only close friend to Russia. Of course, the U.S. had a lot to say about this, saying that Russia has violated the UN resolutions that you can't give anything to North Korea because of the defiance of the nuclear missile tests. This also made the statement that they didn't know Russia even made luxury cars and that Kim should make sure that there's a warranty on that car. I also didn't even know that Russia even made cars after the Lada car that was made back in the late 70s, early 80s, I think. It was that super budget car, no frill, utilitarian design, steering wheel, pedals, pretty much it. The car that Putin gave Kim was a Urus, supposedly to be their version of a Rolls Royce. It is a 7-ton car and is bulletproof. That's pretty standard for autocratic, murderous dictators. This is Eric Lecain here on the World News Jam on RJTV. As we know, Trump has been impeached 2 times in the U.S. Congress. Once for holding up aid to the Ukraine until the president agreed to say he was investigating Joe Biden for corruption, and of course for trying to overthrow the government on January 6th. Since the Republicans have been Since Trump has been impeached, the Republicans have been trying their darndest to impeach Joe Biden for something, anything. They seem to figure that if they can at least have a trial for impeachment, then later they can say, see, Trump and Biden are basically the same. They are both impeached. The problem the Republicans keep having, though, is because of the evidence. They don't have it. While Trump was loaded with mountains of evidence in his impeachments, the Republicans are having the hardest time finding some evidence against Joe Biden. But they fairly recently say they found the smoking gun, the big piece of evidence to nail the Biden crime family. Finally, they had an FBI informant, actually years ago, that had the goods on Joe Biden and his son Hunter Biden. They had accepted $5 million each from the Ukrainian company Burisma in 2015 for protection from Biden while he was the vice president. So even though this wasn't something Biden did as president. Still, the Republicans thought it was enough to finally get him impeached and a trial off the ground. Now, preface this by saying that Trump's DOJ investigated Joe Biden and the 𝗪𝗲𝗪 company, however, could not find any clear-cut, suitable evidence to make an inquiry. However, a special counsel was put to the case to investigate it now. Their main piece of evidence was the FBI informant, but here again, the problem in the case was the informant. He was an informant with the FBI for many years. No one was really sure what this guy's skill set was or even what he looked like. If you look him up on the web, all you see are pictures with his face covered. He's one of those secret agent types. But with using these types of guys, you need to differentiate between what is true and what they think you want to hear. And also, who else they might be spying for. Well, this week, after the Republicans were sure they had the evidence they needed against Joe Biden, turns out it was all false. In fact, it was a specifically planned lie. In fact, it was such a lie that the guy that told it to them, that Alexander Smirnov, he's been arrested for lying to the FBI and creating false documents. The super spy appeared in court on Thursday, being charged with creating false and fictitious statements in a government investigation. He didn't enter a plea. Here again, the interesting thing is that no one even has a picture of this guy. And when he left the courthouse, he covered his face with a mask and wore a hat. They actually turned him loose, but then they rearrested him. He said he had $15,000 in his account, but it turns out he had closer to $6 million. Where did that come from? So currently he's considered a major flight risk. There's already lots of things coming out about this guy, that he was actually feeding the Republicans information given to him by the Russians. That in reality, he was a double agent, working for both the Americans and the Russians, just like you would see in a movie. He was working for the FBI and giving them exactly what the Republicans wanted to hear. The evidence they had not been able to find, that needle in a haystack, that piece of candy in the Brussels sprout store. But here again, when something like this plum is just handed over to you on a silver platter, the reason is because it doesn't exist in the first place. The Republicans went on the show after show in the past months claiming they finally had the goods on Biden, that they had a witness that was there that had firsthand information that Biden had accepted bribes. The words they used about the informant were trusted, highly credible, reliable. But at the time, the FBI was like, we're not really sure about this evidence. The problem was there was nothing else. Nothing. No one to corroborate the story. Everything they had was all based on the one guy. The guy that no one had even had a picture of. A guy that supposedly associates with assassination squads from other countries. And he is the main piece of the whole impeachment case against Biden. What the FBI finally realized was that this guy was not only working for them, but they found that he was working for the Russians. And the Russians were feeding him stories that they were giving to the FBI. They realized finally that the stories he was giving about the meetings he was in with officials at 𝗪𝗪𝗪, the Ukrainian company that hired Hunter Biden, well, he could not have possibly been in those meetings. The old problem of that you can't be in two places at once. So when they questioned him, he finally spilled the beans on the entire plot. So the special counsel was using his information that he was given to form an impeachment case against Biden, and now he was having to arrest his own witness. Now, the interesting thing was that when the guy was arrested, they were forced to let him go by the judge, who would not hold him, but did take away his passport, ordered him to stay in the country. However, these kind of guys, these secret agent types for other countries, they can easily slip away unseen. So they had him arrested again on the same charge. I'm not even sure exactly how they did that. They charged him first in Las Vegas, and then they charged him, the same guy with the same charge, in California. This guy's looking at possible 25 years in jail, so I could see how he might want to skip the country. The Russians have been masterful at feeding Republicans disinformation to create false political issues to interfere in the U.S. elections. The Mueller report, example after example of how the Russians manipulated information in order to change the outcome of the election in 2016, and several people were sent to prison because of that report, including Donald Trump's own campaign manager, who turns out was feeding internal election reports to the Russians. Even after the 2020 election, several people were arrested for working with the Russians to collect information. This has become a pattern of the Republican Party. It's not that they are working with the Russians. However, they are continually being manipulated and duped by misinformation that is planted to create havoc and chaos to further their own agenda. They just create a story that the Republican politicians want to hear, or a piece of information that they need. It's like planting a pill in your dog's food. They want the food so bad they don't realize what the true meaning is. The old Republican Party in the U.S., they looked at Russia as the enemy, as the communists we need to be afraid of and fight against. But it seems like these days, the U.S., the enemy is the Democrats, the liberals, the gays, the immigrants, the woke. And the Russians are helping to fight them, the Americans. Even now that this guy Smirnov has been arrested and ties have been made to a Russian misinformation campaign, the Republicans are still saying, well, we're not giving up yet. Even with all this embarrassing information, the Republicans are now having to deal with what they are saying. They're going to continue, no matter what, to try and impeach the president. However, the only evidence they had is completely blown up. If I knew what else the Republicans had or what their side of the story was, I would tell you. But when they were asked by reporters the other day, nothing was coming out except, well, we're looking into this and we will get back to you. This is Eric Lecain on the World News Jam on DZRJ's Radio Bandito. This week, I was in a long discussion at an event here in Manila in regards to what will happen to the Palestinians in Gaza. Of course, we have been discussing the war in Israel for the last several months. The last time we talked about the Israeli military was planning to take over the southern parts of Gaza, including the city of Rafah, in which the people were told to go to escape the war. Now they're being told to move again. And Israel is talking like they now have complete control of Gaza and will now be the ones to decide who gets in and out of the country at the southern border. Meaning, as far as we can see, they will completely cut off the southern border to Egypt. Okay, let's say for argument's sake that Israel does control the Gaza Strip militarily. So what now? This week, Israel has sent a negotiating team to Paris to possibly decide a ceasefire and hostage return and thus ending the 4-month war. But is it going to be that simple? Is Israel going to agree to letting the Palestinians come back to their homes and Hamas come back to their posts in the government? No, they're not. This week, Netanyahu presented a plan to his security cabinet, and the return of Gaza to the Palestinians is not really an option in that plan. In fact, it's in Netanyahu's mind that Israel will now be the ones that are in charge of security in the region. They will be the government in Gaza and in the West Bank. They will control the Egyptian crossing from now on, from both sides of the border. But has Egypt agreed to this? No one is sure yet what the official word yet is, but honestly, I don't think so. Also, Israel says they will be the ones to overhaul Gaza's civil administration and education systems. They will now decide what is taught and not taught in the schools. The school's curriculum will be decided by the Israelis as to what they will be taught from now on. History will be according to them. The new Netanyahu plan calls for de-radicalization in the education system, which Israel accuses the Palestinians of teaching anti-Semitism and hatred of Israel. They plan to shut down the 𝗪𝗪𝗀, who is the group supporting the refugees of Palestine. If you remember a few weeks ago, we discussed the idea that several personnel working at the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, the 𝗪𝗪𝗀, may have been in on the planning of the attacks on October the 6th. Besides that, Gaza will no longer be able to receive money from foreign countries such as Qatar unless it's approved by Israel. But mostly the plan for after the war is officially ended is that Palestine will not be under any circumstances be granted statehood, that it is part of Israel, and that's the end of the story. Netanyahu stated that giving the Palestinians that kind of recognition is simply a huge reward for unprecedented terrorism. But of course, this has consistently been the reason that Hamas has given for the start of the war in the first place. They want statehood. Right now, the U.S. has even floated the idea of granting the Palestinians some kind of form of statehood. However, this seems to be non-negotiable in the eyes of the Israeli leader. But is any of this even realistic? In theory, Egypt has rejected the suggestion that Israel could control its border with Gaza. And the United Arab Emirates, who said that they would foot the bill to rebuild Gaza, said that if Israel will not grant statehood, that they will back out of that agreement. And what about the UN and the aid sent through the 𝗪𝗪𝗀 that supplies most of the aid to Gaza? The people of Gaza are on the verge of imminent famine. So they can't just do away with the whole entity. And even though Israel says that this is all about removing Hamas, what about the Palestinian Authority? Where are they going to fit into all of this new and improved Israel? Are they just to be left out? Does Israel think they're going to go away quietly? And with all this on the table, what about the hostages? Is this plan going to help the negotiations to free the hostages? I mean, the Palestinians, especially Hamas, who are in control of the hostages, are obviously not going to give up a single hostage if the total right to exist is non-negotiable. But on the flip side, what happens if Rafah is taken and thousands more Palestinians are dead and the war is concluded and the Israeli election happens? Everyone is calling for an election in Israel, and most likely Netanyahu will be voted out of office. Who will be the next leader of Israel? Because if there is a new leader and he is a right-wing conservative, the problem in the Middle East could just continue on and on and on. But if it's not, if the next one is, say, someone that will fall in line with the ideas of the U.S. and some of the needs of the Palestinians are met, could peace in the Middle East be resolved? But right now, it seems likely both sides will keep saying the word non-negotiable. Right now, half of the entire population of Gaza is sitting at the border of Egypt. So something is going to give sooner or later. Egypt has closed its borders to Gaza and has increased its guard. This has put an obvious strain on the relationship between Egypt and Israel. If Israel continues their push of the Palestinians even farther south, this is more likely just telling them, not only are we taking over your country, but also you need to leave. But where will all those Palestinians go? They're going to assimilate into an Arab country? I don't think after all these decades, the people of Palestine are just going to give up, fighting tooth and nail to get freedom, to stay in the land that they believe is theirs. They're just going to give up on everything they believe. What's going to happen when Israel invades Rafah? Can you say, let's just start all over again? Countries that were friends to Israel may not be so friendly again after that. It's like you walk in the kitchen floor after you broke a glass. You can get caught anytime. Israel is walking a very fine line here. But will people just wait and see what the problem escalates to? The conversation I had with a group in Manila asks, Is it better to let Israel just run the whole country, or better to get a two-state solution? Well, we couldn't figure it out. It seems like neither side will be able to figure it out anytime soon. This is the World News Jam, talking about subjects outside the Philippines that are on people's minds. It was 1972. Nice warm evening on December 7th. But in the middle of a dark skyline, a bright explosion lit up the night sky. It was the Apollo 17 spacecraft lifting off its trip to the moon. Saturn V rocket hurled 3 Americans to the moon, where they moved from the service module to the lunar module named Challenger and safely sat down on the surface of Earth's one and only moon. On this trip, the astronauts brought a car, drove around the moon, collecting rocks and sand and more rocks. They ended up leaving an experiment package to send back data to the Earth for the next few years. And on December 19th, in the command module named America, the 3 moon men safely splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. After the mission, the commander of the mission said, "We will return with peace and hope for all mankind. Godspeed to the crew of Apollo 17. But that was 50 years ago. And since then, the U.S. never went back. Just think about it. With the technology that the U.S. had in 1972, they went to the moon. You know, in 1972, we had phones that you had to walk to pick up. We only had 3 channels on the TV and no internet, and they sent a man to the moon. But that was the last mission the U.S. sent to the moon, 1972. Why? Why did the U.S. stop going to the moon? Money, that's why. It was just crazy expensive to see someone going to the moon. They estimate that today's money, the Apollo program, will cost around $257 billion. And in the end, what do you get? Well, you get some moon rocks and some moon sand. And these trips to the moon were, at the time, getting boring. The first couple of ones were interesting, but then once you've seen 1 or 2, the rest all kind of look the same. And if you needed subsidies for your farm or your school or your roads versus giving billions to go to the moon, well, many congressmen were like, I want to get reelected, so let's not spend all our money on these trips to the moon. And also the issue of constantly changing presidents. Presidents come, they stay for 4 to 8 years. Some will have great plans for space and the moon, and the next one will come in and say, we're not doing that. Let's do some Earth stuff instead. So over the years, there have been projects in place, but costs continue to rise, and one project is scrapped, and then a new one started. But then, last week, there was a bit of a breakthrough. Just to be clear, all the U.S. moon missions have been done and funded by the U.S. government. NASA is an agency of the government that handles space exploration, and they are the ones to build it and send it. But again, last week was different. For the first time in 50 years, the U.S. went back to the moon, but it wasn't NASA that was in charge. It was a commercial company that sent the mission back to the moon. The company, Intuitive, sent its flagship robot-controlled Odysseus to the moon last week. In fact, NASA actually had to rent space on the ship for its experiments. Now, just to be clear, there were no actual people on this mission. It's just a robot. But just like in previous trips to the moon, the mission came with some drama. Just before the descent to the lunar surface, Odysseus's ranging lasers malfunctioned, throwing off the calculation of altitude and velocity. Fortunately, NASA had some experimental lasers on board, and somehow the engineers were able to patch those lasers into the navigational computer and were then finally able to get Odysseus on the surface. Then, for a while, anyway, there was no signal from the robot. There was a thought that they would not be able to get communication back at all, but eventually, after a few hours, a few bars popped up on the ship's phone and communication was reestablished. After some time, they realized that Odysseus was upright. Things were back functioning normal. The robot even sent back some data and photos right away. The Odysseus robot is basically at the south pole of the moon in a crater near to a 5-kilometer high mountain. Interestingly, this is one of the areas where they are thinking of sending the Artemis mission. Remember, we've talked about the Artemis mission, the manned mission to go to the moon, set up a base of operation. This is interesting because there are some areas in that part that have never seen sunlight. It's believed that maybe this is where the moon might be harboring water. Actually, it's ice, which of course can be made into water. And water is a problem when going to the moon because you can't grow water. You either have it or you don't. And no matter how much you put on board or you reprocess with your pee, eventually it's going to run out. And as you may already know, water is heavy and very hard to transport. But if they could discover that this area has ice, as they think, this could be a major discovery for putting humans on the moon for long periods of time. But even though there are no humans on this mission, it's very important because at least the U.S. is back in the space game. For now, they'll be working on out issues that the humans will have to deal with when they head back to the moon. That'll be later this decade. Who knows? Maybe if they get things set up well, we can start having weekends on the moon. Just hope that I live long enough for when the price comes down a bit. This is Eric Lecain on RJTV, channel 224 on Sky Cable. Now for the story I was asked about the most this week. The countdown has started on the Trump civil fraud case and when he will have to pay the massive judgment. They needed several documents to sign, so there was a slight delay. But as of now, I do believe that the clock has started ticking. As we know, week before last, that Trump was found liable, not for sexual assault, that was the week before, but for fraud. In the state of New York, the judge found that Trump had defrauded banks for years by simply claiming his assets were worth more than they were. For example, you go to the bank, you borrow money. Let's say you need 5 million peso loan. Now, the reason you want to get 5 million pesos is because the interest rate on 5 million is way less than, say, 4 million. So you ask for 5 million, but the bank says you need to put up some collateral worth 5 million. Well, my home is worth 5 million. So the bank is like, okay, fine, we trust your documentation. Here's your loan. But the home you're talking about is just a bamboo hut that you made for about 30,000 pesos. Now, you pay back the loan and all is fine, except that it's not that fine. You should be paying the interest rate on a 30,000 peso loan, not a 5 million peso loan. Get it? Several others will not be able to utilize a loan because you have used up much of the bank's loan assets. So that's why it's illegal to do this. So Trump has been doing this for years and years, unchecked, until last week. So 30 days from now, Trump will need to pay $454,156,783. And if he doesn't, there's a problem. Right now, there is a person sent by the courts to oversee Trump's businesses. Since Trump has also been banned from doing business in New York, and if Trump doesn't pay up in 30 days, then between the person and the state attorney, they will just take the money. They will take all his cash. And if it's not enough, then they will start selling off his buildings and his golf courses. Now, Trump has $1 billion worth of real estate under his name, but the problem is almost all or all of it is loaned out to the banks. So if you start looking at each of his properties, you will see massive loans attached to each of them. And by the way, for every day that Trump doesn't pay back this judgment, he will take $111,000 per day. That's $1 million, or roughly 56 million pesos every 9 days in interest payments. Now, this does not include the near 90 million that he must pay in the sexual defamation suit that he also just lost. Trump just asked for an extension on that payment because if he doesn't pay it, here again, they will just take it. Besides all this, according to Trump's financial statements he made to run for president, Trump owes another $350 million to the banks on his properties. I'm sure those banks are a little nervous right now, wondering where Trump will get the money to pay them once the state attorney starts collecting. I mean, banks need to collect on his properties. However, the properties are overvalued. This is a dilemma. If we look back at Trump's past loans, we can see a pattern emerging. Back in the 90s, Trump had an airline company, a yacht, a bunch of casinos. He borrowed the money from the banks to do all these things. He was building the brand of Trump, and the brand was going to be worth billions. But the problem was Trump did not run the businesses very well, and they were all losing money. So the banks got together and decided enough is enough, and they started to put a stop to Trump. And when they started looking at Trump, they found that his business empire was not exactly what he said it was. He was, as described at that time, a fraud. But as Trump himself said, if you borrow $10,000 from a bank and you don't pay it back, you're in trouble. But if you borrow $10 million from a bank and you don't pay it back, the bank's in trouble. So the banks had to let Trump continue to promote his businesses in order to get paid. In the middle of all this, there was Trump steaks, Trump wine, Trump the board game, none of which seemed to catch on. And then eventually he would declare multi-bankruptcies in his businesses. Now, moving up 25, 30 years, Trump is in essence doing the same thing again. He gets the bank to give him big loans, which he secures based on fraudulent statements. This is according to the court documents and statements. But besides getting this money, Trump is also getting his supporters to pay his legal bills and fines for all his different cases he's fighting. There's even a GoFundMe page right now in which money is pouring in to help with his most recent fines. Trump has even put his daughter-in-law as co-heading up of the National Republican Party. This worries many in the party because they think her sole purpose is to divert money from the donations to the Republican endeavors to pay for Trump's legal bills. Also, Trump this week released a new golden basketball shoe. So for $399, you can have a Trump golden shoe called the Never Surrender High Tops. But there's a trick to getting that shoe. You buy it now, but if you read the disclaimer, you may not get the shoe until July or August, and they have the right to delay it even more. Now, this should not be overshadowed by the new Trump perfume, which comes in a bottle with Trump's head on it. It's called Victory 47, and that has been referred several times as looking much like something one might use to pleasure yourself with. But in any case, the ex-president of the United States is selling golden sneakers and perfume to his supporters. Will this be able to raise the over $500 million Trump is going to need pretty soon? Will it help his upcoming legal bills on his criminal trials? Especially because Trump's legal teams are asking for money up front now from Trump. He has a track record of not paying his lawyers, so many of the good ones are asking for money ahead of time. In any case, I think he is going to need to sell a lot of those sneakers and perfume. Maybe he might bring back Trump steaks. This is Eric Lecain on the World News Jam here on RJTV and DZRJ Radio, thanking you for spending your Sunday evening with us. Join us next week here on the Jam. So for then, be safe out there, and we will see you next week.
The views and comments of the hosts and guests are not necessarily those of the station.